All of the negative events which happened in the previous decade are difficult to understand unless they're related directly to personal finance. What I want to do now is look at how several macroeconomic trends directly affect individual consumers. We'll start by looking at the S&P 500. As this chart shows, the S&P saw many increases and decreases over the past decade. At the beginning, the S&P was near its all-time highs of around 1,500, but by 2003, its value had decreased by almost 40%. It saw a quick rebound up through 2008, but then the global financial crisis destroyed value through 2009. This has significant ramifications for the average consumer. For example, in America, people are frequently told to save their money and invest in the stock market for the future. However, if you followed this advice in the previous decade, your returns would have been abysmal. This chart shows how much money a person would have if they invested $5,000 on January 1st of each year of the decade. Now, this is a stylized example, and I know most people don't invest this way, but my point is to show that people would actually lose money if they invested regularly in the stock market over the past 10 years. For example, in the year 2000, if you invested $5,000 on January 1st, 2000, today you would have only $3,455 of your original value remaining. The same pattern is repeated for many of the subsequent years. The problem is that the S&P 500 was extremely volatile. For every increase, there was an even larger decrease. Overall, the only years in which people would have seen an increase in value were in 2003 and in 2009. A look at the total amount of money invested in this pattern shows just how destructive the S&P 500 was to investors' value over the past decade. As you can see here, if you invested $5,000 a year starting in the year 2000, you would have invested a total of $50,000, and at the beginning of 2010 would have had only $42,961 left. The same pattern holds true for every year unless you started investing in 2009. And to me, this is simply incredible. It's hard to fathom that investing in the stock market in this way would have actually reduced the amount of money you had in the end. You would have been better off investing in CDs or certain types of bonds than in equities for the past decade. Now, of course, this isn't representative of everyone's experience, but it does show just how risky the stock market was over the past 10 years. Next, we'll look at home prices to see if they've shown any improvement over the past 10 years. As you could probably suspect, the housing market was not a good place to make money in the previous decade. The Case-Shiller 20-City Home Price Index shows how profound the spike in home values was in the early part of the decade and how quickly these prices tailed off. This chart shows the value of your home today if you purchased it in a given year in the past decade. For example, if you bought your house in the year 2000, its value today would be 11% greater than what you paid for it, according to the Case-Shiller Index. This would be an annual return of only 1%. However, if you bought your house in 2005, its value today would be 34% less than what you paid, which would be an annual return of -8%. And these only get worse if you made the mistake of purchasing a house in 2007 or 2008. Essentially, the only people who made money on houses purchased them extremely early in the decade, before the speculative bubble really kicked in. Now, I know the Case-Shiller price index isn't applicable to every market, but it shows as a general representation that the traditional advice to buy a house probably cost people money over the past 10 years. If the equity market and housing downturn weren't bad enough, the unemployment picture is even worse. This chart shows the growth in annual unemployment from 2000 to 2009. In 2000, unemployment stood at only 4%. As the recession following the September 11th terrorist attacks continued, unemployment reached a peak of around 6% in 2003. However, it fell back to lows around 3.5% to 4% in 2006, But toward the end of the decade, unemployment spiked, taking an unparalleled jump to 9%. And today, unemployment currently stands at around 9.7%, just off highs of 10%. So, in the past decade, equities lost money, the housing market collapsed, and you are more likely to lose your job and be unable to find a new one. If the equity market and housing picture weren't bad enough, the CPI has increased even as people have been losing their jobs and having difficulty finding new ones. Adjusted to an index level of 100 in the year 2000, today the CPI is over 125. That's a 25% increase in a market basket of goods over that time period. One example is the cost of gasoline. As you can see here, the cost of gas has almost tripled from where it was in the year 2000. Consumers are having to spend more for everything they purchase. Our next two examples will show two extreme cases of where consumer goods have actually increased at a faster rate than that of the CPI. The first area I want to look at is college tuition. According to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, college tuition has increased by almost 60% since the year 2000. Remember, the CPI increased by 25%. So college tuition has annually increased at almost twice the rate of inflation. A similar trend can be seen when looking at the cost of medical care. Medical care costs have increased by 40% since the year 2000, and this trend is likely to continue in the future. Again, this is at a far faster rate of increase than the CPI index itself. As we've seen, equity markets and home prices declined precipitously in the previous decade. Unemployment increased, as did the cost of basic goods and services. Specialty services like education and medical care increased at a rate far faster than inflation and the CPI. One factor that compounds all of these other difficulties is the actual decline in real wages for every group of education level in the United States. This chart shows real wages by education level in $2,000. As you can see here, every group has shown a decline in real wages. This includes high school graduates, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, professional degrees, and even doctorates. As you can see from this chart, every education level has seen their real wages decline if measured in year $2,000. This shows just how pronounced the increases in price have been for the average American. The stagnation in real wages has made it impossible for most families to be able to meet the financial demands placed upon them by increased prices, stagnating equities, and a falling housing market. Basically, if wages have not increased, all of these factors are much more pronounced and are felt much more acutely by the individual consumer. Overall, I think the most profound part of the previous decade is the fact that it began with so much optimism and ended with such desolation and pessimism. Even today, there's a debate over how long it will take for our economy to recover and whether new jobs will be created at a quick enough rate to prevent further foreclosures and just general economic malaise. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the previous decade. I know it's probably not the most optimistic entry I've ever done, but I do think it shows just how difficult the economic climate has been for the past 10 years. And perhaps the best way to look at things is that basically, as an economy, we've hit the bottom and hopefully we'll be able to recover in the future. I don't know how long that recovery will take or what form new jobs may be, but I do think Americans in general have a resiliency to be able to rebound from these types of catastrophes. So I hope you've enjoyed this look at the past 10 years, and hopefully the next 10 years will be a lot better. Thanks as always, and I'll see you next time here at Economic Outlook.